Hey everybody, hope that you're doing well today. I wanted to make a relatively short video here that is going to provide a little bit of perhaps some unusual tips to supplement the many other really good tips videos that are already out there regarding Path of Exile 2. And I've watched a few of them, I think pretty consistently. They're offering pretty good advice, but I've not heard anybody really talk about the things that I'm going to mention here. So what I'm going to hope is that there are a few new players. This video is, of course, targeted to new players. It's probably not going to be of much good to you if you are already an experienced Path of Exile player, but there are some new player peculiarities, I think, that affect some of us that I'm hoping that some of these tips will help with. And I want to be very clear, these probably are not going to be best for everyone. I think all of us kind of learn at our own pace and kind of in our own way. These are things, however, that did work for me, and I'm pretty sure they will at least work for some of you. So here we go. With no further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. The first thing that I'm going to suggest is that every player, despite what you hear about the sorry state of melee and the sorry state of the warrior and things like this, every player should start this game out playing melee. Now, why am I saying that? Because I didn't. I had watched a couple of streamers play the first day, and already, my experience with PoE 1 kind of led me to wonder if maybe melee was going to be a little bit more challenging than any type of a ranged class would be. So I didn't immediately start melee myself, and I wish I had, and let me explain why. So the first class that I played was a sorceress, who was fun, don't get me wrong, but when I was fighting many things, particularly bosses, I found that I was kind of running around as far away from the boss as possible where I could still shoot back and do some damage to it. My second class was a ranger, and same thing. I was running around trying to stay as far away from the boss as possible while still being able to get attacks off and do damage to it. And while that is a perfectly valid playstyle, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with playing range classes. And ultimately, I do want to say, I'm not suggesting here that melee, or in particular the warrior, is the most powerful class in the game, because it certainly has not been in my experience. But there is a particular reason why I think it's really important that everybody should play a melee class as early in their PoE 2 experience as possible. And that is because playing a melee class will help you out with range classes, but the converse is not true. Playing a range class is less likely to help you out when you play a melee class. So what do I mean by that? Let's go ahead and see if I can do a semi-coherent job of explaining this. Going back to my own personal experience, my third class that I played was a warrior. And I took the warrior and I went up and I fought against the bloated miller at the end of that very first zone, and he killed me, and I immediately deleted my warrior, and I said, the heck with this, I am going back to playing range classes. And then I realized I actually had a friend who was playing at the same time as I was. And, I think like a day later after I had done that, he told me about his experience with the warrior. And he said, yeah, he didn't have any trouble killing the bloated miller. And so I decided, you know what? Okay, that was a little bit maybe a little bit too spontaneous of me to delete that character. Let me go ahead and create him again and try him again. So I created the warrior a second time, and lo and behold, what I learned from fighting the bloated miller and then fighting the subsequent bosses and so on and so forth, I realized that, okay, melee is more challenging, but that's what you want to do to learn the game in the very beginning. So I apologize for the long lead up to getting to my point here. But my point is, playing as melee forces you to engage with the mechanics of the game, and in particular, the boss mechanics. It forces you to really pay more attention to the different movements that they make, the telegraphs that they give of their different attacks, because you basically have slightly less time in order to react to everything. So you're kind of forced to pay closer attention to the boss moves than you would do when you're ranged, when you're spending all your time running around just trying to stay away from them. And you don't get me wrong, there are ranged attacks that still give you telegraphs that you still have to dodge and things like that with the range classes as well. But overall, what I learned was it takes a little while, but as you become comfortable fighting bosses up close, you actually will then do yourself a huge favor in terms of your performance with all of your different characters, not just melee, but your range classes as well. There are times when you're going to want to play your range classes up close to enemies, whether by choice or by necessity. It's good to understand how not just bosses, but all the different mob mechanics work when you're up close to them. You cannot function well in this game unless you become comfortable with recognizing the telegraphs, recognizing the mechanics, and knowing how to react to them very quickly. And I believe that fighting in melee is the best way to give yourself that experience. I often say, I've said this in other games as well, there's no substitute for developing muscle memory. I think you develop that muscle memory much, much faster if you're using melee. And sort of a related idea when it comes to playing this game and playing as melee and engaging with the mechanics, what I learned from playing The Witch is that particularly once I unlocked the arsonists and the raging spirits, it kind of felt like easy mode at that point, and I was blowing through bosses, barely paying even attention to what they were doing. I had a good friend who was leveling up a monk at the same time that I was leveling up my witch, and he was telling me about his experience fighting such and such a boss, and I was like, yeah, I don't really remember them doing that at all. I don't remember them doing that. I don't remember that mechanic. Because again, it was so trivialized for me by playing The Witch, and The Witch did kind of feel like easy mode, that I just didn't create these really memorable experiences, let alone be forced to actually learn and engage with the mechanics. So that's sort of the converse of playing as melee forces you to engage the mechanics. Some of your more powerful, like in my case, I found that the witch minion build was the opposite, where I was sort of not engaging with the mechanics enough to actually learn them, which is going to be, punishing for me than with other classes as I play those and try to get through those same bosses and not having learned those mechanics the first time. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. Now, I won't say again that you should stick with melee the whole way through the game. I'm enjoying going through the campaign through each of the different classes. I'm far more personally, I enjoy the campaign far more than I do the in-game experience, at least at this point. So it's been a lot of fun doing all the different classes, and I feel like the things that I've learned playing as melee in the early going have also paid dividends for me with the range classes down the road as well. Okay, that's tip number 1. Tip number 2. I don't think there's anything wrong with using build guides, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about build guides in tip number 3 as well. There's nothing wrong with using them. But having said that, these build guides are set up to provide you with the most optimal, I don't want to say purely damaging experience, but your optimal build for progressing through the entire campaign and on into endgame. And there's no question that in the long run, your optimal builds are going to be the ones that focus on offensive abilities for the most part. There may be some exceptions, but for the most part, almost all the build guides you see are going to focus on offense all the way from the very first passive skill points that you apply in your passive skill tree. And I don't think that that's necessarily the right thing for new players to do. I think that once you are good at the game, once you really you understand them, going back to the first tip, once you understand the mechanics, you recognize the telegraphs that the different enemies are giving you, it's a lot easier for your own player skill to engage and prevent you from taking damage. But until you get to that point, you are actually going to be learning the game, moving a little, reacting a little bit slow, getting hit, mistiming your misjudging your dodges. You're going to be getting hit every once in a while, more often than you will later on when you achieve a greater level of skill in the game. And so you're going to be taking more damage, and it's important, I think, for most players, maybe not everybody, but it's important for most players to not get so frustrated because they're just taking damage and because they've focused more on offense than they have on defense. They just can't take a punch and keep fighting. I don't want to say you're going to get one shot a lot in the early game, but you miss a couple of dodges in the Bloated Miller fight, and you could very easily die. That's not a great example because you don't have much in the way of passive skill tree points at that point anyway. But the same thing is true for, let's say, the first half of Act 1. You're going to be fighting things. You're going to be mistiming your dodges. You're going to not exactly be avoiding every telegraphed attack, and so you're going to get hit. You want to be able to take a hit for the most part. And so I do think that this is something to keep in mind, is that while your build guides and your own self-developed builds, for those of us who like to not use other build guides but kind of experiment and create our own builds, ultimately, I think you're going to want to lean towards using your passive skill points on the offense. But in the early going, I think it's valuable to make sure that you can actually get hit a couple of times while you're still in the very, very early part of the learning curve, and be able to survive that without getting too frustrated. So this is going to be a little bit different for each player, your own tolerance for taking damage and for occasionally dying and having to restart fights. Each of us are a little bit different in that respect. But I do think that I think the temptation is out there to look at what the Trailblazers have already done in terms of creating their build guides. Almost all of them that I've looked at, and I don't go out of my way to look at all of them, but I've seen a fair number of them. And almost all of them optimally are going to gear all your passive skill points, at least in the early going, towards the offense. And that is, I just think, something that you have to understand what the trade-off is. Keep in mind that it is not prohibitively expensive to change your skill points down the road. So there's nothing wrong with putting your first few points in your passive skill tree into defense when you're still learning and you're following this advice to make sure that that you can take a punch and keep fighting. And then later on down the road, when you're a little bit more comfortable with the mechanics and you're using your own player skill level to be able to avoid taking damage, just go ahead and respec those back into offense at that point. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. I think that's a perfectly valid approach to the game. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and lead that into the third tip, which is sort of a broader point. Be aware that everything is trade-offs. Whether you're talking about what affixes to put on your gear, whether you're talking about what points to apply to your skill tree, things like that, everything is about trade-offs. And when it comes to learning the game, understand what the trade-offs are in terms of watching videos, not so much like this one, because there's others that go into far more wealth of detail about how to be good at this game than I'm doing in this video. But the build guides and the how to fight boss encounters and best way to do crafting and all of this stuff, those are all very useful. Don't get me wrong. I am by no means trying to discredit any of those videos, but understand that there is something to be said for learning organically. Making mistakes along the way is often a really good way to learn a game. And I do think that for a lot of people, when you follow a build guide, for example, the temptation is there to just look at how they've arrayed their skill distribution in the passive skill tree and just do what they've done. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. Ultimately, I think it makes a lot of sense to follow those build guides. But what you're doing by going straight into that without messing around with anything on your own is you are kind of following, you're following the build craft that somebody else did without really understanding why they did it. You're not really building up that wealth of knowledge for yourself to really make sense of why they've done what they've done, which just means your understanding of the game overall suffers a little bit. So I personally feel like everybody should really decide what they want to do in how they want to approach this game. Do they want to understand how the game works, in which case I think you should understand that there is a trade-off in following somebody else's ideas versus just experimenting and being okay to fail on your own, but treating those failures as a learning experience. Now, again, all of us have our own threshold as to how much of that we're willing to tolerate, but be aware of one thing. This is, for the most part, a single-player game. Nobody is judging you for your own performance. And although it can get frustrating to die to a boss over and over again and feel like, okay, my build is suboptimal, that's why I'm failing, and there could be some truth to that, those failures also contribute to your understanding of the game. And if we treat our failures as learning opportunities instead of just the pure frustrating experience that we're sometimes tempted to perceive them as, then I think our enjoyment of the game and our understanding of the game can go up appreciably. All right, anyway, that's it. Let me know what you think. I know there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with some of these things, and that's perfectly fine. Again, I'm willingly admitting that this is not going to be for everybody, but I do think there's probably a lot of new players out there who experience this game the same way that I do. And again, these are things that I wish I'd kind of thought through before I started playing the game, because on reflection, things like playing the melee build, I did not appreciate up front how much that was actually going to help me out in understanding and engaging the mechanics of everything throughout the rest of the game, even with non-melee classes. Okay, anyway, I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks everybody so much for watching and listening. Let me know what your thoughts are. Hope that this was helpful to some of you, and I will see you all in the next video.